Hello, friends. Welcome to our discussion about the history, the geography, the cultural and chronological context of the ancient Near East. This is our opening to really our background section. If you remember last time, I introduced the idea of the three worlds of the text, that there is a world behind the text, a world in the text, and a world in front of the text. This is a sustained reflection upon that world behind the text. That is, we're going to ask the question, what kind of culture did people who lived in ancient Israel inhabit? This is a part of our larger conviction that the ancient context and the ancient cultural setting and the language of the ancient world were really important for helping people communicate meaning, but also how they understood themselves and how they understood their world. What meaning was to them mattered, and it depended in some way upon their own understandings of culture, of science, of religion, of how families work, of how political institutions work, and all of those are quite different from us and from our world today. No matter what part of the globe you come from, all of our experiences are quite different from the experience of the ancient Israelites. Some of us, of course, perhaps share some different parts of their experience, but they lived in a world that was quite different from top to bottom from ours. So a conviction that we have, and this is part of the textbook, Chris Hayes' textbook called Hidden Riches, talks about this. Part of our conviction here is that no text comes out of nowhere. So the scholar of religion, theology, and philosophy and ethics, Cornel West, has famously said that no text comes from nowhere and there's no viewpoint from nowhere. That is, there's no purely objective rational point of view that doesn't take into account our own culture, our own context, and so on. So the ideas that I have are in some way shaped by the kind of cultural categories that I have been brought up to inhabit. And the language that I use helps to shape my ideas, and also sometimes keeps me from saying or thinking certain things as well. So there's no viewpoint from nowhere. That is, when we read the words of the ancient biblical text, one of the things that we're going to try to do is try to understand their own words, their own worlds. Try to understand their voices as not coming from nowhere and not just skipping over all of history and being directed only to me. But we're going to try to understand what they were saying within their cultural context. So as Chris Hayes put it on page 8 of the reading for today, no text exists in a disembodied ahistorical form. Every text comes from somewhere. Every text is written in a certain language at a certain time by a certain people to a certain audience. Time and place and language all shed light on how a text functions. Language determines who can read it. Time and place shed light on the culture and the people who produced it. Now, that's not to say that ancient people had the last word in what their texts mean or could mean, or what they could mean to us. But what it does mean is that if we want to understand what they meant by their texts, or what they might have meant by their texts, then it behooves us to try to understand them and their world. So, that's what we're going to try to do today. Let me start with this. This is kind of a little story to try to get us in the right frame of mind. This image that you see here on the screen, this is an artist's reconstruction of an ancient site that has been subject to archaeological digs and analysis and so on, and dating and so on. This is the site of Nippur. Nippur was a famous and ancient city in Mesopotamia. It was founded in the 4th century BC or BCE. The 4th millennia. 4th century would be like around the time of Alexander the Great, no, this is around the time of the birth of writing. That is the 4th millennia BC or BCE. That is right around the year 3500 or so BC. This city was founded. It was founded by the Sumerians and then was taken over and repopulated by Semitic-speaking peoples. We'll talk about some of these folks in just a little bit. But this is also the city where Ezekiel, someone you might be familiar with, was taken into exile. So the prophet Ezekiel was taken into exile sometime around the year 597 BC or BCE. So before Jesus, right? So 597 BC or BCE, Ezekiel is taken to the city of Nippur. He's resettled there along with other Judahites, people from Jerusalem who had been captured. And you can see there's a little gate there, right? So when he was processed into this gate of this city, probably in a monumental procession to show off the empire's power, we, right now, at this moment in time, in the 21st century, in the year 2020, we are closer in time to Ezekiel walking through that door in the year 597 BC than Ezekiel was to the founding of that city to which he had been taken. Let me say that again. You and me right now are closer in time to Ezekiel walking through the door, the monumental gate of the city of Nippur in Babylon. We are closer to him walking through that door than he was to the founding of that city the moment that he walked through that door. What's more, ancient Israel was a newcomer onto the scene when it was destroyed. That is to say, when Ezekiel walked through that gate, his own nation was less than 500 years old. That is, Israel, and then split apart, Israel and Judah, really were only around for a few hundred years before the exile. And the city of Nippur had been around for 3,000 years. The reason I'm telling you this story is just so you can feel how old, how rich and deep the cultural history of the ancient Near East already was in the time that we think of as the Old Testament period. Ezekiel was walking through the doors of a city that was already 3,000 years full of history and culture and stories and religion and religious practices and political institutions, of songs, of dance. This was already a rich and thick and deep culture. And what's more, Ezekiel would have been familiar with a lot of those things that he would have seen walking through into the Mesopotamian city. The point is this: ancient Israel was a latecomer on the scene, and they emerged in the middle of a rich and thick culture that spanned from Egypt and Sudan and Libya all the way over to Persia, all the way up into what we call Asia Minor, into what today would be Eastern Europe. This was a full and rich and richly connected and interconnected and interdependent cultural system. It's an Afro-Asiatic ancient world, ancient cultural world, in which Israel was a small part. And when Ezekiel spoke about things like parables, or when he spoke about things like cities, or when he spoke about God, he was relying upon the cultural presuppositions that already existed in the ancient world. Now, this may sound strange because sometimes we think that ancient Israel fell out of the sky. It brought its own theology fully formed with it. It knew everything about God from the very beginning, and it made a culture that was entirely different and shared nothing with its neighbors. But that is just not true. Ancient Hebrew is a Canaanite language. It's almost exactly the same as Moabite or Edomite. It's almost exactly the same as Phoenician, which is Canaanite. Phoenicia and Canaan are, by the way, the same exact word, just in two different languages. Phoenicia is Greek, and Canaan is in Aramaic and Hebrew. Canaanite, really. But in any event, all to say, it was a culture that was shared among all these people, and the Bible is clear about that. Where do Abram and Sarah come from? They come from Mesopotamia. They're Mesopotamian people. And when God calls Abram and Sarah in Genesis 12, God doesn't give them a fully formed theology out of the sky. God says, hey, why don't you follow me and see where it leads? And God doesn't tell them absolutely everything. They have to rely upon the ideas that they already come with Mesopotamian ideas. And Hagar comes from Egypt, and she has some Egyptian ideas about who God is and how the world works. And other people who are a part of the kingdom that ends up becoming Israel, or Israel and Judah, they come from Egypt too. As Exodus 12 says, when the Hebrews leave Egypt, they leave as a mixed multitude with peoples from all over Egypt and from all over the world that Egypt had conquered and enslaved. That is to say, there were lots of different kinds of people that ended up a part of this community. People who came from Syria, people who came from Edom, people who came from the Hittite kingdom. And they weren't ostracized or pushed out because they weren't biologically related to Abraham. No, they were welcomed. And this is true of many ancient people who join with the Hebrew people and end up becoming a part of Israel and Judah. So all to say, Israel and Judah emerge from many different peoples in the ancient world, and they emerge out of those ancient cultures. To ancient Israel, the songs of ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia, those were like their songs. They even borrowed some ancient songs and rewrote them. Psalm 104 seems to actually be based on an Egyptian psalm that was taken and rewritten. Psalm 29 seems to be a Canaanite hymn to Baal, the Canaanite storm god, that ancient Israelite worshipers of Yahweh heard and said, that sounds good. That's got a good beat to it. But I don't like the stuff about Baal, so I'll take it out, I'll rewrite it. This is a song about Yahweh, my God. I mean, that happens today too, by the way. Martin Luther, the reformer, famously borrowed a bunch of drinking songs and rewrote the lyrics and turned it into some of the melodies that you and I know from church songs and so on. This happens all the time. But it happened back then too. The reason that I'm talking about this is because if we want to understand, say, the Psalms, ancient Israel's worship life, then it really helps if we know something about the ancient worship life of the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians and of the Hittites and of the Canaanites, because that helps us understand the symbolic world, the ritual world, the cultural world out of which Israel grew and in which Israel understood itself. So if we want to get at this world back there and try to understand a bit of it, not to be stuck back there and not to disrespect our own world today or our own theologies or our own cultural practices, but just so we can understand that ancient world better. Also so that we can bring some of that and try to understand some of how that might intersect with our own thoughts, our own cultural practices today. How might we learn from these ancient cultural understandings that we can recover in some ways? Some of those tools that we have to recover that ancient world, at least to some degree, are archaeology, where we dig things up and date things and analyze artifacts. Of course, there's arguments about archaeology, but there are some things you just can't argue about. We also can see that there are other tools like the archives, that is, things that have been dug up out of the ground that you can read. Those are provenanced sources. That means where you know where it comes from and where it's been. You dig it up out of the ground and you can date it based on other archaeological layers and other datable things that are buried in the ground with it. And you can find these archives, these ancient texts. Now, not all of them are true or reliable, right? There's false archives all over the place. But nonetheless, it gives you some data to work with. We also could talk about tradition, which is unprovenanced sources that have been handed down, things that we didn't dig out of the ground, and so we don't know exactly where it comes from or how old it is. This is the Bible, by the way. The Bible is an unprovenanced source. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad. That means that it's been so amazing that it's been handed down as a living tradition since it was written. But at the same time, that also means we don't know exactly who wrote this. Now, we might say, well, of course, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Well, we don't know that. In fact, the Bible doesn't say that. It says that Moses wrote some things down, but it's very clear about what Moses writes down, and it never says that Moses wrote Genesis. That's just something that people believe. So we can ask questions then about these traditions or these materials that we've been handed down and think carefully about them. And then also there's comparative study, and that means we look at other similar cultures. Now, people don't generally tell you everything about their culture. That is, most things in our culture we just accept and we just do them or rely upon them, and we don't explain them. It's the same thing as the fish in the water, right? Two fish are in the water, and one fish says to the other, "How's the water today?" And the other fish says, "What's water?" The fish doesn't know how to think about water because it's around them all the time and they've never been out of it, right? In that same way, culture is kind of in us and through us, and in ways that we can't even articulate sometimes. So ancient people don't always tell us everything important about their culture. We have to kind of suss it out. And sometimes we have to suss it out by comparing with other ancient cultures, sometimes that did explain what they were doing, or that do things in a slightly different way that helps us to see ancient Israel in relief with some of the peoples who are around them. So in any event, that comparative study, that's what that book by Chris Hayes is trying to flesh out for us. And that's why it's so important. It seems strange, perhaps, to read some of these ancient stories that we'll read or ancient rituals and so on. But if you try hard to figure out what is this telling me about the Bible and about ancient Israel, we can learn amazing things from comparing ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian culture to ancient Israel. So for this kind of lecture series, for this module here, we're going to cover 5 things and try to just lay out a bunch of information in advance. Now, we're not testing you on this, by the way. Some of this might not be new for you. Some of you might know a lot of these things already, and that's okay. But I'm not going to quiz you on these things or test you on them or force you to memorize them. What I'd like you to try to do for this video and the next video is to try to just kind of sit back and listen and try to get a sense for how the ancient world was different or similar to your own cultural context. I can't explain everything, but I can give you some big ideas, and some of those big ideas will help us, I think, get into the text starting with Genesis 1 next module. So the 5 different sections that we'll talk about today are geography and chronology. So where did this happen and when did it happen? Political structures. How was the world organized politically? And then economy and culture. How do people eat and how do people get the resources that they needed and how were those resources distributed? But then also, how do people write? That's going to be what we focus on for culture. How do people hand on stories to the future? What was tradition to ancient people? And then family structures. How are families organized? As we know, there are many different ways to organize families, even within one culture, our own today. But in the ancient world, there were some patterns that we can recognize that are slightly different from what many of us might be familiar with today. And lastly, religion. We'll talk about what was a god in the ancient world. What did ancient Israel mean when it said God? And what did ancient Israel mean when it says gods? Because they sometimes talk about there being more than one. Of course, they often say there's not more than one, right? It's in the kind of argumentative portions of the Bible sometimes that they talk about that. But we will get into this, that ancient Israel doesn't always believe exactly the same thing about God from moment to moment. Ancient Israel grew in its understanding of God over time, just like I hope all of us are growing in our understanding of God over time too. So in any event, we'll talk about these different categories, really not just from the perspective of ancient Israel, but from the perspective of the ancient Near East as a whole. And I'll explain what that is now. Geography and chronology. Where and when are we talking about? We're talking about this part of the world right here. The Mediterranean Sea to the west, the Red Sea to the south, the Black Sea to the north, and the Caspian Sea to the north, and the Persian Gulf to the east. We're talking about the area of the world that we might call Southwest Asia and Northeast Africa. We might talk about it too as the Afro-Asiatic plates. That's where the 2 tectonic plates meet. This is right up here. Let me get my cursor here. This area right here is the Great Rift Valley, which goes down through Africa, where some of the earliest human bones in the world were discovered near the Great Rift. That goes up through the Jordan Valley. That's part of the Great Rift. So ancient Israel was actually on the African tectonic plate. Ancient Israel is also part of what we might call Southwest Asia today, this part of the world. There's a term for this entire region, which includes Egypt, and we would put Ethiopia in this category too, the Arabian Desert and South Arabia, which is a little bit cut off by this map. But then also all the way to the Zagros Mountains in the plateau of Iran. That's ancient Persia. And then Mesopotamia, the land between the 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, basically modern day Iraq. And then the Levant, this area here, which today would incorporate Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, parts of Jordan, and Syria, and all the way up into southern Turkey. So the Levant here, it comes from the French word that means the sunrise. It's a bit of a colonialist term, I'm sorry, but it's better than some of the other terms for the area. People argue about this all the time in ancient studies about what to call this region. The Levant is actually one of the least politically problematic terms. But in any event, but this part of the world existed in between Egypt and Mesopotamia. And then also, this is this area up here that we would call Turkey today, up between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. This area up here, we would call in the ancient world the region of the Hittite culture. The Hittites lived up here in Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. And these were the major power players just before Israel emerges on the scene. So, just to recall here, Egypt, right here, the Nile Valley, right up here. Memphis was one of the capitals of Egypt, and then down here Thebes was the other in the south, the two upper and lower kingdom of Egypt. Egypt was one of the two main powers on the scene during the entire Old Testament period, and then the other major power on the scene for the entire time is Mesopotamia. Now, Mesopotamia was founded first by the Sumerians down here in the Delta area, down near the Persian Gulf. This area was lush and fertile, was easy to grow crops and so on. And then in the valleys here, where the Tigris and the Euphrates River are, those were also excellent places to grow crops, and that's where some of the earliest canal technology in order to inundate and grow crops with water. Those were developed. So those technologies enabled the huge growth of populations. And in what started out as Sumerian populations in the south here were then soon taken over by Semitic-speaking peoples who spoke a language actually similar to ancient Hebrew and other Canaanite languages, and they settled and made the cities of Akkad, which we would call the Akkadian, the seat of Akkadian power, the Akkadian peoples. Also the cities of Nineveh and Ashur, the center of Assyrian power, another group of people who lived in Mesopotamia. So the Akkadians, the Assyrians, and then also Babylon and the Babylonians, like Hammurabi, who we'll talk about a couple times in this course. During the time that the Old Testament is really being written and edited and put together, and the time periods that it refers to, the two major powers are Babylon and Assyria in Mesopotamia. And really whoever was in control, whoever was more powerful at the time, controlled that whole region. But if you think about it here, Mesopotamia is a powerful, rich, very old culture. The earliest writing comes from Egypt, in this part of the world at least, comes from Egypt and from Sumeria. Sumeria seems to have the oldest writing here, so this very rich and ancient and deep cultures of Mesopotamia. Kind of, if they want to interact with Egypt, and sometimes fight with Egypt, or sometimes trade with Egypt, right, depending on how things go, where do they meet? Well, they tend to meet here in the Levant. So the Levant, the area where Israel emerges as a people, it is really in a crossroads between Mesopotamia and Egypt. So just to say, Israel was not important because they were powerful. They were fairly weak compared to even their local rivals most of the time that they existed as a nation. They were powerful because they existed in the middle of a land bridge between the two major empires at the time. And then, of course, a third major empire, the Hittite culture, which really collapsed right before Israel came onto the scene. So you can think of Israel as really a go-between, right, rather than a central power, but also a people who emerged in the midst of a marketplace, right? They emerged in the midst of a meeting point of three major powers. So Israel is from the very beginning immersed in this thick and rich and deep cultural soup. And one of the things we can say about the ancient world is that this area, the ancient Near East, shared a rich cultural tradition They wrote in each other's languages. They sent each other information. They conquered each other sometimes. Sometimes Egypt was in charge of the region. Sometimes Mesopotamia was in charge of the region. But nonetheless, they were all immersed in each other and interwoven with each other. And Israel emerges in the midst of this interwoven and thick and rich and deep culture of the ancient Near East, which is why we'll be reading other cultures' texts about their rituals and their histories and some of their practices and so on. There's some of their songs, some of their stories, so that we can understand ancient Israel that much better. So just to give you a sense of some of these political entities here, this is just a different map here to show a bit more clearly some of these different ancient cultures. So here's the ancient Near East from a slightly different perspective. And here is ancient Sumer down here near the Delta. Now, Sumer is a big power early on in the kind of cultural civilization map of the ancient Near East, but it dies out quite early, in fact, as it is taken over by Semitic-speaking peoples, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who move in and displace Sumer. So here's Assyria in the north and Babylonia in the south of Mesopotamia, this area between the two rivers. And then here in the Levant, you'll see the people of Aram. Aram is also Syria, and it's often associated with the capital city of Syria today, but also in the ancient world, the cultural and economic center of the Aramean people was Damascus for quite some time. So Damascus is sometimes used to refer to these folk. Aram, or the Arameans, is used to refer to them, and they spoke Aramaic, which is a language that's very close to Hebrew and was ended up being used to kind of dominate the region, and that's why the Jews ended up speaking Aramaic at the time of Jesus. So in any event, you got Aram here, and then Ammon underneath. The Ammonites were a culture and a language that was very similar to ancient Israel. It seems pretty clear, to me at least, that Balaam, who we have actual text from, Balaam the prophet, he's an Ammonite. And then Moab and Edom are two other kingdoms down here. Moab, you might remember from Ruth. Ruth is a Moabitess, and we'll study her text in the second semester. But then Edom down here, and Esau is associated with Edom, and so on. So these languages and cultures were very similar to ancient Israel, and they're part of what we would call Canaan. Now, Canaan isn't a name that anyone who lived in Canaan would have used. It was a name that was put on it by other people for economic reasons. Now, the Canaanites didn't seem to mind this name. They just didn't use it for themselves. They would have said, I'm an Ammonite, or I'm a Moabite, or I'm an Edomite, or I'm a Phoenician. Well, they actually wouldn't have said that. They would have said they were from Tyre and Sidon and Byblos, actually. But in any event, the Canaan was a term that was put on these folk because Ka'anan means purple. They were the purple people, because there was a type of snail, the murex snail, that you could crush up and turn into purple dye and make it into a very costly cloth, because purple is a very rare color in the natural world, and it was associated with royalty. So kings wanted these purple snails and the fabric that came from them. So that was why Ka'anan, it's the purple land. Phoenike is a word that is one of the words that you can use to say purple in Greek. So the Phoenicians, that means Canaan. Same thing, just two different languages. But no one said they were Phoenician in the ancient world. They didn't say, hey, I'm a Phoenician person. They would say, I'm from the cities of Sidon here, or Tyre, or Byblos. And they were city-states that were aligned with one another, and they were kind of thought of themselves as cousins. And they thought of themselves as cousins to the Israelites. They literally called them brothers, the leaders of some of the Phoenician city-states and some of the leaders of ancient Israel. So that is to say, they share language, they share culture, they share resources, or they trade resources at least, and they saw themselves as very similar. Moreover, we can say that Hebrew is almost exactly the same language as ancient Phoenician, or the language of Tyre and Sidon and Byblos, or the language of ancient Damascus, or the language of ancient Moabites and Edomite people. So this was a very tightly woven group of ancient people. And then we have over here Lower Egypt. It's called Lower Egypt, even though it looks on our maps like it's to the north, because the Nile runs downhill. So Lower Egypt is actually physically lower than Upper Egypt, where Thebes is. Upper Egypt is kind of down here off the map. But Memphis and Tanis and Ramses, we'll come to talk about those when we talk about Exodus. Okay, so that's kind of this world, right? Bounded by the Mediterranean Sea to the west, bounded really by Persia to the east, and the Zagros Mountains. Persia is kind of a latecomer on the scene, even later than Israel. As we'll see, we won't even really talk about them till the second semester of the class, when Persia becomes a major power in this region. Israel is almost always dominated by their neighbors. They are a small player in the global game, and that shapes the way that their religion works, that shapes the way that their prophets work and talk, it shapes the way that their political systems work, and as we'll see throughout the course, most of Israelite history is negotiating its own survival in the midst of a game of rivals that surround them. So, all to say, that's kind of where we are, right? Where in the world we are. Now, when does this stuff happen? So let's talk a little about chronology. Chronology meaning the sequence of events. Now, this is a somewhat unhelpful designation of time, but we're going to use it because it's what pretty much everyone uses in the scholarly world, at least as shorthand for these different ages and times. So there's a way of dividing up history by technology. What kinds of technology were available to the people at the time? Again, this is a very strange way in some ways to divide up time, but it kind of works for ancient Israel for other reasons, not because of the technology, but because these general ages actually separate out at major moments of transformation for ancient Israel, which kind of makes some sense because technology does tend to transform the way we do things. So, in any event, not always for the better, by the way. We can talk about the Stone Age. This is the age when people used stones for tools. And this doesn't mean people were unsophisticated. Sometimes it's like cave people. No, I mean, this could be very sophisticated people. Much of the birth of writing, which is a really strange, would be a hard thing to invent, by the way. If we all think we're smart because we can write, but if you put me somewhere and didn't give me an education and so on, and had me grow up in a desert island by myself, I wouldn't have come up with writing. I think I'm not smart enough for that. All to say, these folk who invented writing lived during the Stone Age, and we talk about the Stone Age up to about 3000 BC, when there was a change or a transformation to different types of tools that were used, bronze tools. Now, by the way, I said BC there. You'll see I use BCE often. Now, BC means before Christ, and AD means Anno Domini, the year of our Lord in Latin. Those are confessional terms. I'm a confessional Christian, but also I want to be clear that your textbook was written so it could be used in, say, Jewish contexts, right? The Coogan textbook. And I actually like that about the Coogan textbook. It's trying to speak to many different contexts, and I think that makes it a helpful textbook. But in any event, all to say, people reading that text may not believe that Jesus is the Christ, right? So year of our Lord might be kind of putting something onto the text that's not there. So you'll often hear me use what's shorthand for scholars, and it doesn't mean I don't believe in Jesus, I do, but it just means that I'm trying to use the conventions of scholarship in history. Now, so BCE, you can say, means before the Common Era, some people mean. I think it makes more sense to say before the Christian era, before the advent of Christianity and the growth of Christianity in the first few centuries, CE or AD. So I'll tend to say BCE now that I've explained that. Okay, so Stone Age up to about 3000 BC. Then there's invention and proliferation of bronze tools, which really changed what people can do and what they can build and how they can fight, by the way. That age goes up until about 1200 BCE, when there's actually a major transformation that we'll talk about in a minute. And then there's the Iron Age, which begins with the use of iron tools, but also is a point of transformation for ancient Israel, because this is when Israel emerges as a people, sometime around the year 1200 BCE. And that age goes all the way to 587 BCE with the destruction of Jerusalem. So in this semester, we're going to start with the Iron Age, right around the year 1200. We'll talk a little bit about the Bronze Age, but we just don't know much about what was going on with people associated with Israel in that time. But we'll really focus historically on the Iron Age, so 1200 to 587 BCE. And then next semester, we'll pick up and move into and beyond the Iron Age into the Persian period and then the Hellenistic period, which we'll get to that later. So let me just set the scene a bit about what was happening right before Israel emerges, right around the year, let's say, 1400 BCE. So right around the year 1400 BC, we call this the Late Bronze Age People didn't know it then, but they were right on the cusp of inventing iron tools and disseminating them throughout the region, which would transform the kinds of war that people could make, but also the kinds of tools that people could make and the kinds of things they could build and so on. So in any event, there was a massive change that happened right at the beginning of the Iron Age that had nothing to do with iron. We'll talk about that in a moment. But just right before Israel emerges, you can see this political map here of the region, and you can see that Egypt was a major player and actually dominated the Levant. The Levant being that area on the eastern Mediterranean seaboard that includes the Phoenician city-states of Tyre, which is on the map there, and Sidon and Byblos, but also Israel and Judah, which hadn't emerged yet. So they will emerge in the Levant. But at this time, there were a bunch of city-states, including Jerusalem, which was a city-state. It pre-exists the Israelite people and the Hebrew people. We also know a bunch of other cities that existed at this point in time that end up being turned into Israelite cities, like Hatzor in the north. But also there were other people groups living there at the time that we might think of. We might put the term Canaanite on them, just like the Hebrew people did, but just recognize that they thought of themselves as very distinct people groups, even though they spoke a very similar language. But uniting them was political subservience to Egypt. So Egypt dominated that region of the Levant. They wanted it because it contains lots of trees. So you've heard of the cedars of Lebanon, a famous grove of trees that spanned the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountain ranges, which were prized throughout the ancient world because they were large and very powerful for building, right? They could be used to frame and build huge buildings, which were difficult to do in both Egypt and in Mesopotamia, which lack trees to a large extent, and especially big trees for building, but also minerals. Egypt and Mesopotamia, people build with bricks because they're made out of clay, but there aren't as many mineral deposits as there are in the mountains of what we would call the Levant. So that was a rich area that people actually wanted to dominate, both Egypt and Mesopotamia. But also it was used as a military buffer. So Egypt wanted this land because if they controlled it and built forts there, then it meant that Egypt was very difficult to invade. And Mesopotamia wanted this as well. But you can see here that there was Egyptian control of the region, and that we have letters actually from ancient kings and other political leaders who lived in Jerusalem and so on, Canaanite political leaders who wrote back to their lord, Pharaoh in Egypt. This is a lot of those letters come from the time of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who is famous for forcing kind of a singular worship. We'll get to that later, but worshiping the sun god, kind of an interesting moment of not really monotheism, but monolatry, worship of one god. A very rare period in ancient Israelite history. But in any event, this was the situation in the region. You can see that the Hittites existed in central Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. There was a state, the Mitanni people, who vanished, and they were destroyed by one of the other players on this stage that I'll get to in a moment. But then we have the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So starting in the year, really around the year, 1800 BC or so, Babylon becomes a major power and dominates southern, what we would call today southern Iraq or southern Mesopotamia. And then the Assyrians dominated northern Mesopotamia, and Hammurabi of Babylon conquered, was part of controlling this region right around the year 1800 BC and the rise of Babylon. From that point on, there's really a power struggle between the Babylonians and the Assyrians as to who has power in the region. And whoever has power in the region then has global power, at least for what they thought the globe was, the limits of their knowledge of the globe. They thought to be world powers here. So we can see that the Assyrians dominate Egypt, and the Assyrians and the Babylonians are always vying for power. This entire semester we'll talk about the Assyrians, the Egyptians, and the Babylonians, and their machinations for power, because it's so important for Israel, because whoever's in charge, they dominate Israel. So, in any event, this shows you a little bit of the lay of the land, but something amazing happens right around the year 1200 BC, and I'm actually going to move my little face down here. something amazing happens right around 1200 BC, and this is right at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, but this has nothing to do with the bronze or iron technology. This just has to do with a global environmental catastrophe. Right around the year 1200 BC, there were a series of droughts. We can tell this because of botany, like archaeological botany or archaeobotany, people who dig up seeds and test them and so on, and think about soil layers and try to date different soil layers and test the health of the soil and so on. We can say definitively now that there were a series of droughts throughout the Mediterranean basin and into North Africa and the Near East, and even into Central Asia. And this led to the collapse of farming and the collapse of civilization centers that depended upon importing crops. Right? People living in cities in the ancient world, like the modern world, often don't grow their own food. They import it from elsewhere. So the importation fell apart, right? And because the importation of crops started to fall apart, these cities begin to, and the political centers begin to hollow out. If you can't pay your troops won't stick around, right? They'll go look for food themselves. So what we see is migration of many populations of people right around the year 1200 BC, including people who lived on islands that today we would talk about as the islands in the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey. These were people who spoke a language similar to Greek, to ancient Greek, and people who moved around from these islands and ended up trying to settle in several places. They were called the sea peoples because they got in boats, they ran out of water, and ran out of food. They got in boats and they went looking for places that they could live. They ended up sailing over to Crete, sailing down into Egypt. They were rebuffed in a major battle with Pharaoh Ramses in 1175 BC. They got back on their boats. They went over to an area that was controlled by the Hittites. They were rebuffed by the Hittites, and then they ended up coming down to a place that today we would call the Gaza Strip. That is, they came and landed on a basically uninhabited part of the beach nearby what became the Philistine homeland. These are the Philistines. The Philistine people are Greek island peoples who ended up migrating because of environmental catastrophe to uninhabited lowland areas in the Levant, in the southern Levant. So they become the Philistine peoples. They found 5 major cities and lots of little cities, but the 5 major cities form an alliance with one another. They quickly adopt the local languages and local culture, but they keep a little bit of their Greek culture and Greek language as well. So that's how you can kind of tell that they're Philistines, but that's what the Philistines are. They're these folks who come from the sea and migrate and land there. There are other peoples, including the Syrian people or the Aramean people, who are displaced from a place called Kir. We don't actually even know where this is. They don't tell us where this is, but they had a homeland that dried out, and they migrated and they found Aram, this area over here to the northeast of what became the Kingdom of Israel, and settled there. And so there's other populations that move around. And also during this time, the people of Israel emerge as a people. We'll talk more about how this process happened, but just to give you a sense of what was going on in the world at this point in time. But also there was a political vacuum because all the major powers began to devolve politically and militarily. So there was a chance for local city-states and local peoples to flourish independent of this domination of foreign powers for a few hundred years. From 1200 BCE to about 800 BCE. We call this the Bronze Age collapse, but really it spans the beginning of the Iron Age. So you'll hear people talk about this kind of a moment of a political power vacuum in which little local kingdoms and other kinds of organizations of power, political power, can evolve and grow. And so the kingdoms of Moab and Edom and Israel and the Philistines and the Phoenician city-states, and we can also talk about Ammon, right? These other entities really emerge and become their own peoples and own political entities right at this time. So I don't think it's any kind of wonder why Israel emerges when it does. It's because it was possible for a people to emerge at this point in time as a recognized political entity. But we'll talk more about how that happens and some of the disputes about how that happens and why that happens in a few weeks. So what happens after this power vacuum? Well, there's a transformation, as you can see here on this map, which shows you the early Iron Age, the age after the collapse, right about 1200 to 800 BCE. You can see that the Greek city-states emerge, but up in, there you go, Greece. But also we can see that the Assyrians end up dominating in Mesopotamia, and they will dominate until really about the time of Nebuchadnezzar, who is one of the first great Babylonian kings to reassert the Babylonian kingdom. But for the first, most of this semester, we'll be dealing with the Assyrian Empire as really the major power to the east of Israel. The Arameans are to the north of Israel, and they emerge as a people at this point in time. The Phoenician city-states form alliances and emerge as political entities. We can see here Syria and Damascus sometimes allies it. There's two different groups of Aramean tribes that band into different political entities. So there are changing kind of groups of these, but the Bible tends to treat all of them as the same and as kind of an enemy of Israel in some ways. But also there's some fascinating texts that we'll talk about where these folk, there are questions asked about why are we fighting these people, right? So then you can also see Ammon emerges as a political entity. We don't have Edom and Moab in here, but they do emerge as political entities in this time, and Egypt's power is curtailed, and the Egyptian political power remains basically within the Nile Delta and the Nile Valley region. So that's like the moment that Israel becomes its own kingdom and begins to grow really is around the year 1000 BCE. And as I said at the beginning of this, Israel and Judah are both gone as kingdoms by the year 587 BC or BCE, which is when Ezekiel's taken into exile. He's taken in 597. In 587, Jerusalem is completely destroyed, and so it's a less than 500 year trajectory really for the kingdoms of Israel and Judah as independent entities. So this is compared to say Babylon, which has been around for a long time, or Egypt, which has been around for 3,000 years by the time Israel emerges on the stage. So just to give you a sense of this kind of scope of history. Now, I am just going to run briefly through this. Don't memorize this. This is just for you to get the scope and scale of the ancient Near East. This is just a chronological overview, right? So Egypt, we have records of Egyptian civilization and habitation and culture from around the year 5,500 BC, going all the way to 3,000 BCE. We don't have written records, and there don't seem to be kind of monumental architecture that would show us that there were kings around. In order to build monumental architecture in the ancient world, generally it took a lot of organization and often took forcing people to do things for you. People don't want to build monuments; they want to farm and eat their food. So when we start to see monumental architecture emerge, and we start to see writing emerge, and we start to see things like the pyramids emerge, then we know we're dealing with organized political states that have a hierarchy, and we'll talk more about those in just a moment. So we can see that the early dynastic period, kings and pharaohs is just the name for king in ancient Egypt, starts around the year 3000 BC, and this is also when writing emerges in ancient Egypt. Hieroglyphics, but also they had shorthand ways of writing too that were easier for scribes to write and read. But then you can see the pyramids were built sometime around the year 2500 BCE. This is, by the way, just think about it for a second here. This is 1,500 years before Israel emerges as a people. The pyramids are built. By the time Israel emerges as a people, Egypt's not building big pyramids anymore. The pyramids are 1,500 years old by the time Israel emerges as a people. Just think about that, the scope of that time for a second. What that means is that when Israel comes about as a people, Egypt feels already old, and in some ways, it has seen its most powerful days behind it. This is kind of a narrative we'll see in Israel over and over again, that Mesopotamia is always to the Israelites feels like the more threatening power for most of their existence. But so you can see these different periods of Egyptian history that deserve study in their own right, and Israel pops up late, and you can see there the emergence of Israel in yellow. So Mesopotamia. Here's a little image of Hammurabi. This is Hammurabi over here, Hammurabi's Stela or Hammurabi's Code, which we'll talk about more in coming weeks. But you can see that we have records of major urban centers that begin in the Sumerian period around the year 4500 BC in what's today southern Iraq. The invention of writing is sometime around the year 3300 BC in ancient Sumer. The Akkadian people take over and dominate for several hundred years and are a power for quite some time. But then we can also see the Babylonian period with Hammurabi arises around, if you think about Hammurabi, about 1800 BC. He dominates the region and turns Babylon into a major power. So Babylon actually is founded quite late in the history of ancient Mesopotamia. Sumeria has been around for 2,000 years by the time Babylon is even founded. But it rises to power quickly. The Assyrian Empire here is an important thing to note, and the Neo-Assyrian period that comes after it, this is when Israel emerges, is during the Neo-Assyrian. Now, they didn't call themselves Neo-Assyrians. It just means the second major Assyrian Empire. Notice that the Assyrian Empire came about right before the fall of all these major kingdoms, right? And there's this kind of lull in global political power because of the collapse of the Bronze Age. But then after a few hundred years, Assyria is able to patch together a major army again and begins to invade the peoples around them and reestablishes their empire. And by the year 800 Assyria is able to start pushing into the area near Israel. So they pop onto the scene near really the end of the biblical history, if you're talking about the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So then Israel emerges during this Neo-Assyrian period. And then Babylon rises and takes over in 612 BCE from Assyria. And so you can see the Babylonian Empire is short-lived. They are around for less than a century. So Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon seems like this kind of great power, but really they were a blip on the scene. They just happened to be the ones that destroyed Jerusalem before they themselves were destroyed. So we'll talk about that again at the end of the semester, but just so you can see the kind of scope and scale. So to finish off our chronology of the ancient Near East, the third area, remember Egypt and Mesopotamia are the two main areas we'll be talking about this semester that are kind of competing for the region of the Levant. The major geographical area is the Levant itself, the area where Israel emerges. We can say that the first fortified settlements that we find in the Levant are in the city of Ugarit, famous for being excavated. It's in Ras el-Shamra, Syria today, but in the ancient world was known as Ugarit and was destroyed by invading armies and burned, which preserved actually the clay tablets on which they wrote things. In about 6,000 BC, they got the first fortified settlements there that we can date in some way archaeologically, which means that 6,000 years before Jesus, there are fortified cities in this region. That's 5,000 years before Israel emerges as a people, as a political entity. They've got cities in the Levant. So Israel emerges out of this thick, rich culture, and they are they're fully a part of this culture from which they emerge. Of course, there are some differences between them and their neighbors, but those differences would be really small. Like if you saw an ancient Israelite and talked to them and were able to understand them, and then talk to a person from ancient Ugarit, they'd be really much more similar than you and I would to the ancient Israelite, right? They shared a cultural conception of how the world worked, which we'll see again and again, starting with Genesis 1, which is an ancient way of thinking about the world and how it was formed. So, the founding of Sidon and Tyre, you can see here some of the Phoenician city-states. Sidon is founded in 4500 BC, 3,500 years before Israel emerges as a kingdom. Tyre is founded in 2750 BCE, and as I pointed out, the era of that Egyptian dominance of the Levant is from about 1800 to 1200, so 600 years of Egypt dominating the region. This leads to Egyptian culture and Egyptian religious practices, Egyptian material culture, like what they wear, what they eat, and what tools they have, and what kind of art they make, and things like this, what kind of poetry they write. All that stuff of life is thoroughly inflected with Egyptian material culture and just culture itself, right? By the time Israel emerges. So Israel emerges at the very end of this period of Egyptian dominance. Egypt continues to try to exert influence on the Levant, but can't really hold it in any significant way for the entire biblical period. So we'll see this again and again. This is the same exact time that the Sea Peoples, the Philistines, invade the Levant and land there and set up their kingdoms. And we can also say that this is the same period in time that Israel and Judah rise as kingdoms, right around the year 1000 BCE. So then we have these kind of periods that we'll talk about for the rest of the class. For this semester, we'll talk about the era of Neo-Assyrian dominance and Babylonian dominance, and that leads to the destruction of Judah and the exile. But then Persia, remember Cyrus of Persia, right, rises up and sends the exiles home. So there's an era of Persian dominance for a couple of centuries, and then there's Alexander the Great and the Greeks. And then, of course, the Romans come after that, and that's the New Testament. So these will be the time periods that we really focus on in this class. The background stuff that I'm giving you now, you don't need to memorize that. You don't need to really know it, but what I want you to take away from this is to just be wowed by the historical scale and scope here, but also to be thoroughly convinced that Israel doesn't exist in a vacuum. They exist as a people in tension with and relationship with the many different peoples around them, and they come out of these many different peoples. Like I said, Israel speaks Canaanite. They understand Egyptian material culture. They have political dealings with the Mesopotamian peoples and the Syrian Aramean peoples for the entire time they exist. They never exist outside of these tensions. So in the next video, we'll move on to talk some about political structures. What kinds of political structures existed in the ancient world, and how did this shape and form people's lives?